Chronicles of Narnia: The Last Battle, Chapter 14. Night Falls on Narnia. They all stood beside Aslan on his right side and looked through the open doorway. The bonfire had gone out. On the earth was all blackness. The fact you could not have told that you were looking into a wood if you had not seen the dark shapes of trees ended and the stars began. But Aslan roared yet again, and on their left they saw another black shape. That is, they saw another patch where there were no stars. The patch rose up higher and higher, became the shape of a man, the hugest of all giants. They knew Narnia well enough to work out where he must be standing. He must be on the high moorlands that stretch away north beyond the river Shribble. Then Jill and Eustace remembered long ago, in the deep caves beneath those moors, they had seen a giant asleep and been told that his name was Father Time, that he would wake the day the world ended. Yes, said Aslan, the third not spoken. While he lay dreaming, his name was Time. Now that he is awake, he will have a new one. Then the great giant raised a horn to his mouth. They could see by the change of the black shape he made against the stars. After that, a bit later, because he travelled so slowly, they heard the sound of the horn, high and terrible, yet strange, deadly beauty. Immediately the sky became full of shooting stars. Even one shooting star is a fine thing to see, but these were dozens, and then scores, and then hundreds, and it was still like silver rain, and it went on and on. Then it had gone on for some while. One or two of them began to think that there was another dark shape against the sky as well as the giants. It was a different place, right overhead. Up in the very roof of the sky, as you might call it. Perhaps a cloud, thought Edmund. At any rate, there were no stars there, just blackness. But all around the downpour of stars went on, and then the starless patch began to grow, spreading further and further from the centre of the sky. And presently a quarter of the whole sky was black, and then a half. At last the rain of shooting stars was going only low down near the horizon. With a thrill of wonder, there was some terror in it too, they suddenly realized what was happening. Spreading blackness was not a cloud at all, it was simply emptiness. The black part of the sky was the part in which there were no stars left. All the stars were falling. Aslan had called them home. The last few seconds before the rain of stars had ended were very exciting. Stars began falling all around them. But the stars in our world are not great flaming globes like they are. But the stars in that world are not great flaming globes like they are in ours. They are people. Edmund and Lucy had met one. So now they found showers of glittering people, all with long hair like burning silver spears, like white hot metal, rushing down out of them like the black air. Rushing out of the black air, swifter than falling stones. They made a hissing noise as they landed on and burnt the grass. All these stars glided past them and stood somewhere behind, a little to the right. It was a great advantage, because otherwise, now that there were no stars in the sky, everything would have been completely dark and you could have seen nothing. As it was, the crowd of stars behind them cast a fierce white light over their shoulders. They could see mile upon mile of Narnian woods spread out before them, looking as if they were floodlit. Every bush and every blade of grass had its black shadow behind it. The edge of every leaf stood out so sharp you think you could cut your finger on it. On the grass before them lay their own shadows, but the great thing was Aslan's shadow. It streamed away to the left, enormous and very terrible. All this was under a sky that would now be starless forever. The light from behind them, a little to their right, was so strong that it lit up the slopes of the northern moors. Something was moving there. Enormous animals were crawling and sliding down into Narnia. Great dragons and giant lizards and fearless birds with wings like bats' wings. They disappeared into the woods, and for a few minutes there was silence. Then there came, at first very far off, sounds of wailing, and then from every direction, rustling and pattering, a sound of wings, came nearer and nearer. Soon they could distinguish a scrap of little feet from the padding of the paws, and the clack-clack of light of little hoofs from the thunder of great ones, and then one could see thousands of pairs of eyes gleaming. And at last, out of the shadow of the trees, racing up the hill for dear life, by thousands and millions, came all kinds of creatures, talking beasts, dwarfs, satyrs, fauns, giants, calamines, tin men from Archenland, monopods, strange earthly things from remote islands between unknown western lands. All of these ran up to the doorway where Aslan stood. This part of the adventure was the only one which seemed rather like a dream at the time, and rather hard to remember properly afterwards, especially one couldn't say how long it had been. Sometimes it seemed to have lasted only a few minutes, but others felt as if it might have been gone on for years. Obviously, unless either the door had grown much larger or the creatures had suddenly grown small as gnats. A crowd like that could never have tried to get through it, but no one thought about that sort of thing at the time. Creatures came rushing on, their eyes brighter and brighter as they drew nearer to the standing stars, but they came right up to Aslan, and two other things happened to each of them. They all looked straight in his face. I don't think they had any choice about that. When some looked, the expression of their faces changed terribly. It was fear and hatred, except that, on the faces of talking bears, the fear of hatred lasted only a fraction of a second. You could see they suddenly ceased to the talking beasts. They were only ordinary animals, and all the creatures who looked at Aslan in that way swerved to their right. this his left, and disappeared into his huge black shadow, which, as you have heard, streamed away to the left of the doorway. The children never saw them again. I don't know what became of them, but the others looked on the face of Aslan and loved him, though some of them were very frightened at the same time. All these came in at the door on Aslan's right, and there were some queer specimens among them. Eustace even recognized one of those dwarfs who had helped to shoot the horses, but he had no time to wonder about that sort of thing, and anyway it was no business of his, for a great joy put everything else out of his head. Among the happy creatures who now came crowding around Trinian and his friends were all those whom he had thought dead. There was Runeward the Senator, and Jules the Unicorn, and the good boar, and the good boar and the good bear, the far side of the eagle, and the dear dogs and horses, Poggin and Dwarf. Further in and higher up, cried Runeward, and thundered away in a gallop to the west. Although they did not understand him, the words somehow set tingling all over. The boar grunted at them cheerfully. The bear was just going to mutter, but he didn't understand. But when he caught sight of the 2 trees behind them, he waddled to those trees as fast as he could, and there no doubt found something he understood very well. But the dogs remained wagging their tails, and Poggin remained, shaking hands with everyone, grinning all over his honest face. And Jewel leaned over his snowy white head, over the king's shoulder, and the king whispered in Jewel's ear. Then everyone turned his attention to what could be seen through the doorway. The dragons and giant lizards now had Narnia to themselves. They went to and fro, tearing up the trees by the roots and crunching them up as if they were sticks of rhubarb. Minute by minute the forest disappeared. The whole country became bare, and you could see all sorts of things about its shape, all the little humps and hollows which you have never noticed before. The grass died. Soon Trinian found that he was looking at a world of bare rock and earth. You could hardly believe that anything had ever lived there. The monsters themselves grew old and lay down and died. Their flesh shriveled up and the bones appeared. Soon they were only huge skeletons that lay there on the dead rock, looking as if they had died thousands of years ago. For a long time everything was still. At last something white, a long level of whiteness that gleamed in the light of the standing stars, came moving towards them from the eastern end of the world. A widespread noise broke off the silence, a first murmur, then a rumble, then a roar, and now they could see what was coming, and how fast it came. It was a foaming wall of water. The sea was rising. In that treeless world you could see it very well. You could see all the rivers getting wider, and lakes getting larger, and separate lakes joining into one, and valleys turning into new lakes, and hills turning into islands, and then those islands vanishing, and the high moors to their left and the high mountains to their right crumble and slip down with a roar and splash into the mounting water, and the water came swelling up to the very threshold of the doorway, but never past it, so that the foam splashed about Aslan's 4 feet. All but now was level with the water, where they stood, where the waters met the sky. And out there it began to grow light. A streak of dreary and disastrous dawn spread along the horizon, and widened. It grew brighter, till the day they hardly noticed the light of the stars who stood behind them. And at last the sun came up. When it did, Lord Diggory and the Lady Polly looked at one another and gave a little nod. Those two in a different world had once seen a dying sun, so they knew at once that this sun also was dying. It was 3 times, 20 times as big as it ought to be, and a very dark red. As its rays fell upon the great time giant, he turned red too. In the reflection of that sun, the whole waste of shoreless waters looked like blood. Then the moon came up, quite in her wrong position, very close to the sun, and she also looked red, and the sight of her sun began shooting out great flames like whiskers or snakes of crimson fire towards her. It's as if he were an octopus trying to draw her to himself in his tentacles, and perhaps he did draw her. At any rate, she came to him, slowly at first, but then more and more quickly, till at last his long flames licked around her, and the two ran together and became a huge ball like burning coal. Great lumps of fire came dropping out to the sea, and clouds of steam rose up. Then Aslan said, "Now make an end." The giant threw his horn into the sea, and he stretched out one arm. Very black it looked, and thousands of miles long, across the sky, till his hand reached the sun. He took the sun and squeezed it in his hand as you would squeeze an orange, and instantly there was total darkness. Everyone except Aslan jumped back from the ice-cold air which now blew through the doorway. Its edges were already covered with icicles. "Peter, High King of Narnia," said Aslan, "shut the door." Peter, shivering with cold, leaned out into the darkness and pulled the door to. It scraped over ice as he pulled it. Then rather clumsily, for even that moment his hands had gone numb and blue, he took out the golden key and locked it. They had seen strange things enough through that doorway, but it was stranger of any of them to look around and find themselves in warm daylight, blue sky above them, flowers at their feet, and laughter in Aslan's eyes. He turned swiftly round, crouched lower, and lashed himself with his tail and shot away like a golden arrow. "Come further in! Further up!" he shouted over his shoulder. But who could keep up with him at that pace? So they set out walking westward to follow him. "So," said Peter, "night falls on Narnia." "What, Lucy? You're not crying?" With Aslan ahead, all of us here? Don't try to stop me, Peter, said Lucy. I'm sure Aslan would not. I'm sure it is knowing not wrong to mourn for Narnia. Think of all that lies dead and frozen behind that door. Yes, and I did hope, said Joel, that it might go on forever. I knew our world couldn't. I did think Narnia might. I saw it begin, said the Lord Diggory. I did not think it would live to see it die. Sirs, said Trinian, the ladies do well to weep. See, I do so myself. I have seen my mother's death. That would but Narnia I have ever known. There were no virtue, great courtesy if we did not mourn. They walked away from the door and away from the dwarfs, who sat crowded against the imaginary table, and as they went they talked to one another about old wars and old peace and ancient kings and all the glories of Narnia. The dogs were still with them. They joined the conversation, but not much, because they were too busy racing on ahead, racing the track, rushing off to sniff at smells in the grass till they made themselves sneeze. Suddenly they picked up a scent which seemed to excite them very much. They all started arguing about it. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. That's just what I said. Anyone can smell what that is. Take your great nose out of the way and let someone else smell. What is it, cousins? Said Peter. A calamine, sire, said several dogs at once. Lead on to him then, said Peter. Whether he meet us in peace or war, we shall be welcome. He shall be welcome. The dogs darted ahead and came back a moment later, running as if their lives depended on it, and barking loudly to say that it really was a calamine. Talking dogs, just like common ones, behave as if they thought whatever they were doing at that moment immensely important. The others followed where the dogs led them, and found the young calamine sitting under the chestnut tree beside a clear stream of water. It was Emeth. He rose at once and bowed gravely. Sir, he said to Peter, I know not whether you are my friend or my foe, but I should count it my honour to have you either. It has not been one of the poets said, noble friend is the best gift of a noble enemy the next best. Sir, said Peter, I do not know that there be any war between you and us. Do tell who you are and what's happened to you, said Joel. If there's going to be a story, let us all have a drink and sit down, barked the dogs. We're quite blown. Well, of course you will be if you keep tearing about the way you have done, said Eustace. So the humans sat down on the grass, and with the dogs that all had a very noisy drink out of the stream, they all sat down, bolt upright, panting, with their tongues hanging out of their heads a little on one side to hear the story. But Joel remained standing, polishing his horn against his side.